Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We'll get started shortly. Today we're joined by Leslie Bowler from Microsoft and Pete Sharp from HSO for Dynamics 365 Fraud Protection webinar. So I'll hand over to Pete now to start today's webinar. Pete, are you there?
Yes, thank you. So hi all, I'm Pete Sharp, Head of Enterprise Architecture in HSO. So it's my team that works with our customers and prospects identifying the relevant part of the Dynamics 365 technology stack to implement into customers to solve business challenges and to put together the right overall landscape of technology. So I'm here today from the HSO point of view to try and talk to you in a little bit more detail of how this technology works and how we can go about implementing it. To support me in this, I have Liz from Microsoft, who's going to kick us off. Liz, can I hand over to you to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Pete. It's great to meet you all. So my name is Leslie Bowler, and I work in Microsoft as the Product Marketing Manager for our Dynamics 365 solutions that have anything to do with commerce, finance, and supply chain management. And within that is our fraud solution, which we'll be talking about today. My background actually is on online payments. So prior to Microsoft, I used to work at SagePay, and within that, managed the fraud solutions and product set within SagePay to help protect online businesses. So today, I'd really like to cover just giving a bit of market context and then the kind of things that you should be thinking about as a business with the fraud solution provider you should be selecting. And then hand over to Pete really to give an in-depth dive into what the solution can do for your business and then some good case studies of why it's great and how it can help. So first of all, just to start on market context, we really know that through COVID-19, we've seen a seismic shift in consumer shopping behavior, and it won't come as a surprise to anyone on this call that there's been a huge increase in online sales. So within the UK, we've seen that grocery, so large supermarkets and food, have more than doubled their online sales. And generally across the board for retailers, we've seen online sales increase by 50% since February. And an interesting change that's happened is not just that there's been this necessary shift to online, but consumers have also been driven to new brands. So where some businesses have struggled with their supply chain and been out of stock, consumers have abandoned their incumbent brand, and that loyalty has actually gone down and they've been driven to shop in new areas. So of course, as you see the increase in online spend increase, fraud costs also do. The fact is fraud is more prevalent online, and with higher transaction volumes to manage through COVID and with the overall growth of online and e-commerce, we're really seeing that fraud is outstripping this growth. So last year in 2019 and in 2018, e-commerce grew by about 12% in the UK. We're a fairly mature market, but the payment fraud grew by 29%. So really that cost of fraud and its prevalence in having to manage that as a business is getting higher year on year. Further, what we're seeing in the market with COVID is financial stability of many consumers is in question. And we're seeing really sort of banks having more caution on accepting online transactions. So this has really increased those rejections from the banks. So it's a legitimate transaction, but banks aren't authorizing as many transactions as they did because they have a little bit more worry about one, fraud, but two, consumers' ability to pay. And we also know with online, banks have less appetite for liability. They really want to pass it on to the business, the merchant, whilst 3D Secure V2 does go some way to mitigate this. Overall, the more customers are spending online, the more you'll see your fraud costs rising. So with increase in e-commerce in COVID, it's an opportunity to grow your business online. However, we do have to consider that this will generally increase the impact of fraud on your business and also the cost that you have. And I also just wanted to share some really kind of specific changes we've seen in the fraud landscape, particularly with COVID-19, using Xbox as an example. So Xbox really has kind of two areas. So we sell hardware, which goes to the person's somebody's house, which they play on. And then we also have subscriptions, so Xbox Live and then in-game purchases. And what we saw through COVID, and will be interesting to see as we go again into lockdown or not, that the first thing that really changed was how much social engineering we were seeing from consumers. So an increase in techniques of trying to get in touch with us, saying they can't afford to pay their Xbox Live subscription, and trying to get basically something for free. So saying things like, oh, my parents have lost their jobs because of COVID, sometimes absolutely legitimate, but not always. So a real increase in trying to manipulate businesses to give something for free, using the macro environment to do so. The second area we saw increase was a real increase in refunds and sort of friendly fraud, so chargebacks. With being an online subscription service, there was a huge uptick in refund requests because essentially consumers were bored and were playing too much and spending too much, which they didn't have. So there's in-game purchases. We kind of say this idle hands are the devil's playground. But when we were having these refunds come through with the reason, some was because of unsustainable behaviors of playing too much, a lot of regret for spending when they shouldn't have, and just generally boredom was causing what was happening. And then the third area I thought was very interesting. And it's quite interesting if you're a retailer that ships goods directly to consumer homes online. It's actually the sophistication of fraudsters over COVID has gone down. So when you're seeing a fraud attack, usually and commonly, goods that are sent out, which the fraudster want, will be reshipped. So it will get sent to one place and then be shipped on to the fraudster. Because of a reduction in movement and the ability to go elsewhere and manipulate other people, actually a lot of fraudsters are getting goods shipped directly to their homes. So we're seeing that sophistication in reshipping reduce. And that was just kind of an interesting landscape we saw change as COVID hit in February, March time across the globe, which is something to consider, that when you're choosing a fraud provider, is being able to keep your fraud rules up to date, to change your business decision making when the macro environment changes and how fraudsters are operating changes. So next, I just want to give a little bit of background on where we came to have and why we have the fraud solution. So Microsoft is a top 10 merchant. We have over 1 billion transactions a year that we process online, and also a multitude of different ways that we have consumers and businesses pay with us. So in-product purchases, we have online stores that sell devices like Surface, in-game console purchases, office subscriptions. So a huge amount to manage as a business overall with online payments. And then also all of our store payments as well. And what we found back about 4 or 5 years ago is that we had over $1 billion of attempted fraud happening online every single year. Some days we'd have over $10 million of attempted fraud. And it was a huge manual burden with our incumbent provider to be able to make sure that we were, one, protecting ourselves from fraud, but two, actually not blocking the transactions and legitimate customers who wanted to shop from us. So we decided to tackle the problem ourselves, and we decided to change our incumbent solution that really wasn't protecting the business and was more manual than it needed to be. And we created Dynamics 365 Fraud Protection. So we originally built this product just for Microsoft, but because we saw such improvements in our KPIs, which I'll talk about in more detail later, we decided to take it to market so we could also allow our customers to benefit from the solution that we created. So when I talk about incumbent solutions and really the fraud market, there's kind of two solutions that you'll find. So one is a more traditional rule-based solution. So if you take fraud from your merchant acquirer or from one of the large schemes like Visa and MasterCard, you'll tend to find that their solutions were built as a rule-based solution. So what this means, it's really like characterized by rules which are created for your industry, your sub-vertical within retail, created around where they tend to see fraud trends, and then it's kind of kept up to date by the provider, and can be very built manually for your business, either by your provider or by your fraud team. Rule-based systems tend not to be real-time. They can't really capture fast changes in fraud patterns, and they can't really learn from attacks elsewhere. So they're very static in terms of what they provide to protect your business. The main focus of rule-based solutions is how they can help really reduce fraud. So it's the fraud and fraud-related costs, so blocking fraudsters from hitting your online business. On the other side, which is where we've seen the market evolve to, and what you should always be moving to if you're not using an AI or machine learning-based solution, is that where it's really using AI and ML, where it's allowing the fraud solution to reason over vast amounts of data, this data coming from across the globe, where they can then apply the artificial intelligence in real time and provide recommendations to your business on your transaction risk, whether it should be accepted or not. The good thing about these solutions is they capture new patterns in fraud up to date in real time, so they help keep your protection current and relevant. You can also, on top of that, then apply specific rules to your business. So let's say you are a fashion retailer and the product line where you see the most fraud is high-end luxury suits. So you can go in and from day one as a fraud management team, add an extra rule to make sure that if it's a suit that's being sold, you have a little bit less tolerance of risk within those suits because you know it's one of your top targeted products, but over time it will learn that anyway as a solution. So really when you're looking at an AI and ML solution, you're really focusing on helping to reduce false positives. So not only reducing core fraud, but making sure that legitimate transactions from real consumers are not getting flagged as fraud and blocked or getting rejected by the bank. So it's kind of more of a balance between letting through good transactions and then also blocking fraud on the other end. So the Microsoft solution that we've built is of course AI and ML based, but it also combines features that go beyond this. And Pete's going to talk about this in more detail in the demonstration that he gives. But basically what we're doing is we leverage a global network of data, so that 1 billion transactions that we do online, and we provide excellent risk scoring. And we work directly with the banks to help improve their acceptance rates. So essentially, we give the banks extra information when a transaction is low risk, so they're more confident to authorize that transaction. So that increases the revenue you get in your bottom line. And ultimately, what we do and focus on is helping you maximize the profit as your business. So it's not just reducing the cost of fraud and reducing fraud, and it's not only reducing false positives, it's finding that perfect profit maximization point for your business to help increase your revenue. And we've got some really good stats of how we've done that within Microsoft, why we're really keen to take this to market and support customers. So we also recognize, and we're going to be talking about two areas in terms of payment protection and loss prevention in more detail, but fraud occurs across the customer shopping journey with you. So from the moment they go onto your website, maybe account creation, so creating an account, whether it's a real account but someone's abusing the system to maybe get discounts for being a new customer, so they're creating more than one account, so 20% off every first purchase, or on account logging where someone is compromising your real customer accounts, trying to do account takeover, steal customer details, then also then to the point of purchase. So when you're using, could be fraudster using stolen cards or discount fraud happening from employees in store. And then fraud can also occur at post-purchase. So friendly fraud where customers are doing chargebacks, which they shouldn't be doing, and giving refunds for stolen goods in store. So we know that fraud occurs across the customer journey. It's not just at point of payment. So what we've created in our solution is really to help with these merchant challenges. And across the account protection side, if you're not looking at that and making sure that you've got a really solid solution to support, you'll see a decreased bottom line. It's a real high cost of account fraud. And ultimately, if you're not protecting the accounts that you have, it causes reputational damage to your business. Really, that's just for online purchases, not in store. And then you have the purchase protection, which can be in store or online, but ultimately managing your fraud as a core fraud team, it increases your operational expenses with things like manual reviews. You have your cost of fraud, so the cost of goods lost and then handling chargebacks, and then also lost revenue. So if you're rejecting a legitimate customer, so you have a false positive, that customer will choose to shop elsewhere because they've just had a poor customer experience. Then finally, the challenge in loss prevention, which we'll talk about in more details what the solution is actually having loss of income from stolen goods being returned, getting improper discounts, return fraud, and really kind of overall operational deficiencies with how you're managing your returns and discounts, and mishandling of inventory and in-store training that can be improved. And we've got a really good case study with Bestseller, which I'll talk about too. Just moving on 1 second. So ultimately, we have three areas of capability within Dynamics 365 fraud protection. Each of these you can choose to have to help support your business. So you could take just purchase protection, just loss prevention if you have a challenge in store. But ultimately, the capabilities are trying to help businesses both online, so that e-commerce, bricks and mortar, your in-store, and omni-channel merchants protect your revenue and reputation, and giving you the tools basically across the board to decrease fraud and abuse, help reduce your operational expenses, and increase your acceptance rates. All of this is built on our adaptive AI platform. And I'm going to hand over Pete just to give you more information, particularly around purchase protection, high-level view of account protection, then loss prevention, and how that really can support your business and help increase your revenue.
Thanks.
So Pete, I'll pass over to you now.
Cheers. So I'll start with a bit of context about what the sort of angle on building this solution has been and what the components of it are, and then try and talk a little bit more about how all of those come together in the fraud protection solution. So these 4 pillars of design will be fairly familiar to anybody that's seen any of the presentations around the Dynamics 365 stack over the last few years, because these are the sort of core approaches that Microsoft take when looking to bring a new part of the Dynamics product to market. Some of these have been sort of alluded to already, particularly the idea of really making it modern and intelligent. And I think this is the core at the heart of the fraud protection product, and how it goes beyond what was in market already in terms of making use of the very latest components of technology to be able to bring together a solution that is using these machine learning and AI algorithms, and is being able to continuously adapt and learn based on what you're seeing in your environment. So it's not something that is merely a static point in time that you then have to do all of the maintenance. It's trying to use the technology to help you evolve that without lots of intervention and sort of back of house learnings that you then apply to your framework. For this to work effectively, it needs to be able to plug into the systems that you use, whether they're existing within the Dynamics infrastructure today, or whether they're part of another sort of application landscapes that you're running within your business. We've got to make sure this can plug into any of the web front ends or storefronts or transactional portals that you're using. And finally, to really sort of personalize it to how you do business, whether that's your expensive suits or your account sign-up procedures, or how those processes come together. Like anything, this needs to be adaptable. So while we have the models and we have the contextual information that forms the start of this process, we need to be able to modify that. We need to be able to tweak the rates for our business. We need to be able to modify what we're seeing coming through and how we apply those rules for ourselves. So these are then bundled up into a number of different components of the overall fraud protection. And this is what I'm going to try and step through and give you a little bit of an explanation of what these different components do. The first of them being the idea of this adaptive AI technology. So everything we're seeing that run through your system here is looked at in context. It's looked at over a period of time, and within that, the trends from the different activities and the different sort of attack vectors that people are using are captured, identified, and made available to you in clear, easy to understand dashboards where you can take some action. And that's a critical piece of this. It's all very well to say we've got a very clever tool that helps you understand what's going on, but if you can't do anything with that learnings, it's not so effective. So what you'll see, this one's the virtual fraud analyst that brings you that insight, and it lets you understand what your profile of fraudulent activity looks like. Where's the long tail of fraud where you can afford to lose a few transactions to cover off the majority of the cost of fraud that you're incurring as a business. And it's the tools within the virtual fraud analyst that really guide you through that process of using this effectively, and working out the right rejection points and the right cutoff for those fraud controls to apply. Now, to do this, it doesn't just look at an individual transaction. So rather than saying, here is a sales order with a certain postcode and a time and a credit card detail, it's trying to look, again, in context at everything that's going on around a user, around an account, or around a session ID that's interacting with you. And not just today's transaction or this second's transaction, but the overall account and transactional history that has led up to this point. And by taking that much sort of longer term view through everything that's going on, we get a lot more data for the machine learning and AI algorithms to use when trying to identify individually fraudulent purchases and activities. And then to do this, while we can identify some fraudulent activities and immediately discount them and block them, we also want to try and increase the rate at which things are being accepted and are being taken through. And as Liz said, this is a lot about what information we provide to the bank. One thing that you might not be particularly familiar with in terms of fraud solutions is what information at the point of checkout you share with the bank when asking it to authorize and settle a card transaction. In most cases, this is very, very limited information, so much so that the bank doesn't have a well-rounded view of the transaction that is being asked to approve or reject. So through the Dynamics 365 Fraud Protection tool, we give the banks a lot more information. And this is done by Microsoft building the network of banks, their relationships and the integrations to them to be able to provide structured contextual information on these transactions, and as a result get a more precise, a more granular and a more targeted set of exceptions and rejections coming back from the bank. And this is quite an important bit when we look at how much of our good transactions and the revenue that we do want that we allow through. Now, one of the things that's very important with any of these tools, particularly those that rely on machine learning and AI, is being able to understand what happened with them. So it's all very well to say we have this amazing product, it'll learn what's going on, it makes lots of intelligent decisions. If you can't understand those decisions, if you can't explain them to a customer who might have been wrongly identified as trying to push through a fraudulent transaction, and if you can't mitigate or modify the outputs of it, then it really isn't very useful. So as in any of the places that Microsoft deploy AI and ML, there's a real focus on making sure that people can see how the decisions have been reached. What are the individual steps that led up to it? What's the information that we're using in this? What scores have been calculated, and how has this been applied to the transaction? And then serving that up in the customer escalation tool to allow people to modify it, to leave transactions in there to run through, and to go in and do that investigative and customer service part. And then finally, while we have this whole process running from taking your purchases to identifying whether we should go to the bank for authorization and settlement, to helping that authorization come back, and then being able to explain the decisions to our customers, there's also the gateway at the start of this process. As Liz said, this is about account creation and protection. So by trying to block who's coming into our network, we can then reduce the load through these other areas. And this is about identifying through the sign-up process, whether it's bot sign-ups or malicious actors raising individual accounts, which actual accounts coming into this contain any sort of red flags for that fraudulent information. And of course, there's a lot of technical detail underpinning these different aspects of how we identify those sessions, those individuals, or those runs of activities that are building up into this. So in terms of how this works, we of course have your website. Sat at the heart of this, and what the entire solution is there to enhance is your web experience, your online presence. And to do that, you'll be connected to the Dynamics 365 Fraud Protection. And of course, you'll have your existing flow through your payment gateway, be that Adyen as a standard connector out of Dynamics or any others, and that's the link into the bank. So from your website, you'll be passing across, of course, the transaction payload, so the individual transactions, whether that's an account sign up or a basket at the point of purchase. But you'll also then be passing over some other details from your website about the individual activities that are going on there, and any of the actions and activities that people are taking on the site as part of the purchase flow. All of this is fed into the Dynamics 365 fraud protection engine, which is then the calculation and the logic tool, the brains behind it, that will feed back to you the risk assessment that allows you to decide whether that transaction continues, and out the other way, pass the information to the banks to try and do that acceptance boosting part, to give them more information to make their decisions on, and to give you a higher authorization and acceptance rate on those transactions. And there are two components to this. So the first is yours, your data held within your tenant and used to make decisions based around your business. And all of this is, of course, fully protected, and it's your IP, and it's owned under your sort of normal data protection rules. The second piece is the wider fraud protection network, and this is where the scale of Microsoft and their solutions really comes into play, because all of the data out of all of these tenants, anonymized and held without any identifying features, is then used within a global training model to identify trends. And this is another quite major difference between the Microsoft solution and some of the others out there in the market. If I'm a fraudster and I go to one website, I log on to my retail clothing store, and I try and push through a fraudulent transaction, I've got a particular way of doing that. I might see it successful, I might see it blocked. A typical fraudster approach would then be immediately to move on to the next website and repeat it and continue and continue. In a traditional model, you're relying on every single merchant successfully responding to attack number one. The first time they've seen that approach, they need to block it to not incur any additional fraud costs. With the Microsoft model, you just need one of the fraud protection network to have seen it. And as soon as that one has seen it and that activity has been identified by the machine learning models, then all of the different users of the Dynamics 365 fraud protection network then have the benefit of using that shared anonymized data to then enhance their own activities and their own fraud protection services. So it's really not only having the set of rules and the learnings and basing that around your activities, but having this shared network that makes use of the activity, not just across a single industry or a single platform or a single approach, but across everything. So if you see a common attack vector starting on Xbox and then moving to retailers' websites and then into some services or subscriptions, it doesn't matter. All of that data is being shared and being used in the learning and decision-making process within the fraud protection tool. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into what the different components of the Dynamics 365 fraud protection product are and how they start to come together to give you a very well-rounded and comprehensive set of tools to manage what transactions you accept and to try and get as much revenue through your commerce sites as possible. Liz, could I please hand back to you now, I think, for a case study?
Yes, so the case study we'd like to use here is actually the improvements that we've seen in Microsoft since integrating and building the solution. So we saw some really solid KPI improvements observed at Microsoft. And for a company that's a top 10 provider, this was in hundreds of millions of revenue gain. But really what we saw, so if we look at these sort of two metrics I talked about earlier, so reducing fraud. So on the bottom left, we have the so a 0.5% reduction in our fraud loss rate from when we started in 2006 and improving over the 2 years to 2018. So just a 75 million OPEX saving because we were losing less, we were blocking fraud, reducing the cost of fraud that we had in terms of shipping goods. Then we also saw a really good improvement in our false positive rate. So around 1.4% decrease, which gave us a really good revenue lift because we were now being able to balance blocking fraud with having more legitimate transactions come through. Then on the flip side, with what we talked about with the bank acceptance rate, so the API we have into the bank, we saw a huge revenue uplift, so over 7.5%, where when a bank had a low risk transaction coming from Dynamics 365 fraud protection, so we were passing them through the API more information about that transaction, they were happier to accept that 7.5% more transactions. So we were seeing our bank auth rate increase, which just directly impacted our bottom line and increased our revenue, which was fantastic. And then the fourth area we saw amazing improvements was actually that we could reduce our manual review rate in our fraud team. So this reduced by 70%. And what it allowed us to do was our financial controllers and fraud managers who were working on manually reviewing these fraud could become much more strategic partners within the business and realign to things which mattered more over reviewing rules, reviewing transactions that came in day by day, and made it much easier for us as a fraud team to manage the business. And overall, that was around 1.5 million of OPEX savings in reducing that manual review rate. And then also what we have, and we're quite proud of, is that it's actually an award winner for the Informed Franz Edelman Award. We see this as the Nobel Prize of AI. So in terms of being sort of signed off and using an amazing market-leading AI and machine learning, we're really at the forefront to help with giving that risk reduction to really help with those false positive reductions and also your fraud losses. But just some really amazing results overall, where we saw that sort of 9% increase to revenue on the bottom line online because of our false positives and higher bank acceptance, and an overall reduction in our fraud costs. So some very powerful KPIs of what we observed at Microsoft after we implemented the solution. And certainly if you as a business has a rule-based solution, you should see very, very impactful results from using our online fraud protection solution. Now I'd like to hand back over to Pete, and he's going to cover how loss prevention works. So this is both an online and in-store solution. And again, I'll finish off with a case study with Bestseller on how this has really helped businesses.
Thanks. So talked a little bit about what happens online, and obviously we're fairly used to that. I think most businesses will have some level of fraud protection built into their online portal, usually in advance of the payment gateway and processing. But of course, in our physical retail stores, there is also the potential for loss and fraud, either by customers or sadly also by staff. So with the fraud protection element, there's a lot of overlap between these two activities, because fundamentally what we're doing is taking a lot of information about transactions and people's activity, and then trying to make some decisions about what looks good and what doesn't, and what we need to go and investigate further or put some rules or some restrictions around. So the Dynamics 365 fraud protection includes a loss prevention capability that can be deployed on its own or alongside the online piece of it. And this is also using the same adaptive AI technology that continuously learns what's going on to look at the transactions going on in the store, to look at returns, to look at any trends in shoplifting, to start looking at improper discounts and voids, and again, to provide that visibility of what's going on and to try and take away the manual effort involved in both the processing of that data and then in the understanding that you want to take out of the other end of it. So much like the online fraud protection tool, this one is trying to collate a lot of your data coming out of the retail stores and to draw some calculations from that. So to learn what's going on and to identify those anomalies and be able to give those back to you and to your retail managers to be able to manage those within the store estate. So this is quite a similar tool. It's going to draw a lot of the information in, and it's trying to present that, one, around sort of individual activities, but two, to give that wider overview of what's going on and to direct your managers to take action in the right places. And it's trying to do that by really how it identifies the information, how it presents it, and how it lays it out to you. So the automated anomaly detection helps that efficiency really by taking away a lot of the manual work. And this is one of the things we often see with loss prevention systems in store. It's not so much that a business can't get to where the losses are occurring and it can't identify where it's losing the money there and how much is going. It's really often about the amount of manual effort it takes to get there and how feasible it is to do that across huge numbers of stores, customers, transactions, and staff activities. So across all of this, it's that bulk processing. It's the sort of taking away the legwork of it, really, that's the loss prevention tool is trying to do. And it's doing this in a very similar way, really, to the online piece. It's taking your, this time, point of sale data and retail store data rather than the commerce store data. It's passing that into the loss prevention model that, again, includes a local instance just for your business, and then the wider loss prevention network that's looking for trends, anonymized trends across all of the users of the platform. And in return, it's giving you this anomaly reporting, and it's identifying and directing you to look in the places where you're losing most money and you have the biggest problems and you have issues going on. So it follows a very similar process. It's built on the latest pieces of machine learning and AI, and it's using that again to identify the trends and to let you take action in the places that it's going to have the most impact. And again, I think, Liz, if I can hand back to you, you've got a case study to really show how effective this can be.
Yeah, absolutely. So we worked with Bestseller last year, and they had been working for several months on trying to understand what was happening in their stores to identify fraud and problems that they were having with discounting and returns. So after months of work, they'd found, I think it was 6 recommendations they needed to make to help reduce discount fraud, help retrain colleagues to make sure that discounts were being applied at the right time, and also help with finding what was happening with refunds. We worked with Bestseller and took their loss prevention capability, took a data from a selection of their stores as an example. So it wasn't all stores to begin with, and we applied this into our loss prevention solution and reasoned over the data. 48 hours later, we managed to come up with the same 6 recommendations they had originally made. So we validated all the hard work they'd put in manually, but then we actually managed to give, I think it was something around another 15 recommendations of what they were facing within stores with particular salespeople and for training, all from the fact that we could use our AI and machine learning to reason over that subset of data. So we've now rolled out across all of Bestseller, which just kind of goes to show the power of what this tool can do to really help speed up that manual overview of what's happening within store, and also you can do it with your online transactions for refunds as well. But Bestseller was a really great company that we worked with, and it was fantastic to see that we could help confirm the problems that they thought they had, and then also identify more within a matter of days, not within a matter of weeks and months like previously. So a very powerful solution, and one which doesn't need to be plugged into D365 Commerce. If it is, brilliant, it's an easy switch on, but can be reasoned over any in-store POS data which you have as a business. So kind of really fantastic case today, and if you want to hear more, just let me know. But then I'd like to just pass back to Pete just to give a bit more of a high level on how to implement and actually how HSO can support your business if you're interested in getting started with fraud prevention.
Thanks. As usual, always the key to it. How can we actually do anything with this? And the nice thing about fraud prevention and loss prevention is it's very, it could be very well measured and KPI driven. As you saw from Microsoft's explanation of why they went into this and what uplift they saw, this is not a nebulous area where we see that, say, there will be some benefits, but they're soft benefits and they can't be measured. For this tool to work, it can be proven. It can be shown in a very sort of defined way exactly what the benefits of using are and what that benefits case will be. But to do that, you need to see the impact of the tool yourself in your environment on your data. And then from there, we can talk about how we move up. So there are three levels of getting started with the fraud protection one. The first one is a very low effort one, and this is very similar to the approach Microsoft took with Bestseller of saying, do give us your data, we'll plug it into our model, and we'll come back with some insights. It doesn't take much to do. We can very, very quickly take that data, turn it around, and show you what the tool would have identified looking back over that historic period. And that way you get a feeling for for how valuable the tool is, how effective it is, how does it compare to the existing solution you've got today. Then, because that's only using historical data, it doesn't really have any ability to learn. So the next step is, you might say, actually, we want to evaluate it. We want to see this running in real time. So we're going to plug it in, but we'll use it alongside our existing solution. And that way we could track the acceptance rates, what goes on with the bank, what level of transactions we go through, what gets identified as fraud in the two systems. And over a period of time, we can compare those two solutions. Depending on how long that runs for, there may be time for the model to actually start learning, and that would give you a much more complete view of the effectiveness of the fraud protection solution. And the third element is to actually go ahead and implement it and do that full API connection and replace the incumbent tool by deploying a fraud protection tool. Now, obviously, this is the one that's going to give the most benefit, because once we have it fully implemented, we have that model learning and being trained on your data over a period of time, and not just days or a couple of weeks, but 60, 90, 120 days worth of data. And that's when you start to see the full benefits of using Dynamics 365 as that primary tool. But really, it's there to prove itself. We don't want to make the case without really the tool making the case for us. So we want to use it, we want to take your data, and we want to be able to demonstrate how and why this is going to be effective to you. Obviously, if this is something that has a really high priority, there's no reason why we can't jump straight to implement or run a number of these in parallel as we start to build up the capability within your business. And then, of course, there's, as usual, a sort of a light touch way of getting hold of some of this. So while we can step through that slightly more sort of staged process of analyzing, identifying and deploying, we also want to give you a fairly quick and easy way to get started on this, particularly given the context that Liz started talking about, the very rapid uptick in fraud that we've seen over the course of this year. And this is really to get you started very quickly by doing Dynamics fraud protection in a day, to have a number of different activities and workshops within that day that takes some of that data, models it, gets you hands-on with the tool, and lets you start understanding what's been going on as part of that diagnostic piece, but as a very condensed hands-on activity, so your staff get an idea of what's going on. And then, of course, if that's successful, there's a rapid deployment approach where we can roll that out into your live environment in a very short space of time. And as Liz said, not only is this available around the rest of the Dynamics platform, so if you've got 365, the connectors are there, be that for retail on-premise commerce or for online commerce, but actually this can be plugged into any existing solution. And some of the customers we're working with today are using other well-known web platforms out there and are connecting the Dynamics 365 fraud protection solution into that. So really, we have a number of different ways of bringing this to you, but they all take the same approach, which is very much product-led and letting the data and the product really justify itself, and taking a very sort of measured view into proving why fraud protection is the right way forward, and then being able to take that from that proof point very quickly into deploying it and realizing those benefits for the business. Thank you. That ends our introduction into where the Dynamics 365 fraud product has come from, and hopefully a bit of understanding of how it works and why we think it's really something worth investigating for your business.